This video is brought to you by the good folks at KEH. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. And today I want to talk a bit about what makes a photograph great, a photographer worthy, by exploring informed analysis, personal projection, and some of the pedestrian aspects of legendary photographer, member of the mid-20th century New York School of Photography, and pioneer in color street photography, Saul Leiter. Although, before I do, a quick word about our next Streets of New York workshop coming up March 25th through 27th. It's a wonderful mix of classroom instruction covering everything from the history of street photography to gear choices and techniques, exposure and composition, how to approach people on the street, and more. Multiple rounds of constructive feedback in, I think, fair to say, a uniquely supportive way. And of course, getting you out on some of the world's greatest streets for the genre with like-minded photographers and having a blast doing it. Maybe even helping you refine or hone your unique artistic voice. Space is limited. We only have a few seats left. So if you're interested, please hop over to www.3bmep.co/street23 to sign up or learn more. Claudia and I are looking forward to roaming the streets of New York with you. Okay, let's get into what makes a photograph great, what makes a photographer worthy, and let's get a little subversive, just like Saul himself. Now, straight up, I love Saul's work. He and Ernst Haas are two of my favorite photographers when it comes to color street photography, though I also appreciate their earlier black and white work as well. But hey, that's just me. My reasons for enjoying his work are my own, sometimes going far beyond the images themselves to his origin story and his philosophy, although I will cover neither of these things in detail here, and I sometimes struggle with each. And this is a critical, more general point I want to make right here and now. I believe there is no such thing as objectively great art. Objectively great craftsmanship, yes. Art, no. I'm not at all sure Saul would have agreed with me, but he might have. 20th century painters Picasso and Dali, for example, were objectively great craftsmen before they became renowned artists. Early on, each had mastered the ability to approximate the real world years before creating paintings like Guernica and Melting Clocks, respectively. Johannes Vermeer, one of Saul's favorite painters and an absolute master of the Dutch school, combining extraordinary artistry with extraordinary craftsmanship, evident in his fidelity to natural light and color. What about the abstract expressionist painter Jackson Pollock, who Saul actually knew? Well, Pollock did not evince the craftsmanship of Vermeer, Picasso, or Dali, but in the 1940s, fidelity to reality was not the point. Anti-figurative, abstract expressionist painting was the new thing, born of the political surrealism which preceded it, and in response to the hyperrealism of the new high-tech industry of photography, which is a whole other fascinating subject, again for another time. But in any event, whether you like Pollock's work or not, matters not at all. Saul Leiter was himself an abstract expressionist painter before and during his photographic career. Quite apart from that, there's this. Pollock's number 17A, at the time I'm recording this video, is the fifth most expensive painting ever sold, approximately $200 million at the time of sale. The person who bought it must have thought it was really great art. Or a solid investment choice stored in an offshore vault for tax purposes. Except that what I just said is completely wrong. Whether you like Pollock or not, in the end, is the only thing that should matter to you about whether or not it's great. Just as you are the arbiter of whether a photograph is great or not, a photographer worthy or not, for you. Including your own work and your own measure as a photographer. Although it must be said, if one harbors ambitions to have anyone else appreciate his or her work, I think that is something entirely different, yet paradoxically exactly the same. Because I think great art is utterly subjective. In reality, a conversation between the consumer of the art and the objet d'art itself, even if only one end of the conversation actually exists. It is what each of us brings to that metaphorical conversation, a lifetime of experiences, interests, knowledge, skills, joy, pain, psychological fault lines. In other words, it is what and who we are, which determines the extent to which a photograph resonates with us. This is a far more difficult thing with which to grapple than a crappy menu interface, the exposure triangle, or which piece of gear to buy or use. These are all elements of craftsmanship. Of course, there are roles to be played, dramatically powerful roles, by those members of the art ecosystem we might call thought leaders, the critics, curators, gallerists, agents, patrons and investors, muses, people whose constellation of experience, knowledge, skill, community, affinity align with one another in such a way that they share a perception of what is great or what is worthy and pursue that perception with clarity and ambition. And this is where I want to bring in Saul, because he was a very different kind of cat. It strikes me there are a tremendous number of people in the world who are driven with the idea that life has meaning only if you succeed greatly at something, and I think that sometimes there's something very nice about people who don't inflict their own ambitions and drives on the rest of the members of the human race. Saul Leiter. Let me offer you a highly abridged version of Saul's background. Saul was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1923, the son of a rabbi, a Talmudic scholar of some repute. His father expected Saul to follow in his footsteps, although Saul's mother recognized Saul's more artistic leanings, giving him a Detrola camera around the same time, maybe a little bit earlier. He began his studies at Talmudic Academy in New York City. But his heart lay with painting, actually, and even though he tried again to honor his father's wish, this time at Telsha Yeshiva Rabbinical College in Cleveland a couple of years later, by 1945 he'd left that track altogether. His paintings exhibited in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and California. Saul returned to New York City in 1946 to make it as a painter, an artist, but by 1947, the idea that photography might be a better way to make a living began to take root, courtesy of the encouragement of his friends, photographer W. Eugene Smith and abstract expressionist and occasional photographer Richard Pousset Dart, and a visit to the Museum of Modern Art, where he saw Henri Cartier-Bresson's post-war retrospective. Saul began his exploration in color photography while continuing to hone his black and white work, relying on an Argosy C3, an Auto Graflex Jr., and a twin-lens Rolleiflex. I think it's fair to say Saul probably liked gear. Long story short, he became a highly regarded commercial photographer, mostly fashion, and a fine art photographer by the mid-1950s. By then, his professional work had appeared in Life magazine, Harper's Bazaar, Esquire, and his personal work, in other words, work he did for himself, had been displayed at both the Museum of Modern Art and George Eastman House. But it was the reassessment of his color street photography with 35mm slide film during that earlier era, driven by an exhibition at the Howard Greenberg Gallery decades later in 1997 after two earlier exhibitions of his black and white work, a follow-up show there in 2005 called Early Color, Saul Leiter, and a subsequent book of the same name published in 2006 that led to widespread acclaim for him as a pioneer in color street photography. The rest, as they say, is history. In the years since, what makes his photographs so special has been the subject of great study and analysis, erudite and passionate discussions about his influences from Vermeer, Mondrian and Rothko to the aforementioned Gene Smith, Richard Pousset-Dart, and more. The way he represents three-dimensional reality within the two dimensions available to him in photographs, his use of expired color slide film, a nostalgic yearning of society itself, a sense of isolation, and more. But I am struck by two things. First, I am struck by Saul's own dismissal of almost everything I've just mentioned, although I won't cover all of it here. Let's begin with classic deconstruction. I think the explanation for certain things are not the real reasons for certain things. There is an element of mystery. Saul Leiter. Saul wasn't big on deconstruction. He was just Saul. He did see a link between how he painted and music, however. I enjoy taking a brush and using it on the surface, making a mark and making another mark. It's a little bit almost like jazz, you know? Saul Leiter. I suspect, had he been asked, Saul might have acknowledged that same link in his approach to photography, but then again, he saw photography and painting as quite distinct. When I did photography, Saul said in a conversation with New Yorker art critic and reviewer Vince Aletti just 6 months before he died in 2013, still available on YouTube, by the way, and the source, in fact, for most of these quotes, I'll put a link to it down in the show notes below, maybe someplace up here if I remember. I wasn't thinking of painting. I have been told that some of my photographs maybe indicate, maybe, that I am a painter, but photography is about finding things and painting is different. It's about making things. Saul Leiter. As for Vermeer's influence, I don't think he influenced me. I think Vermeer is one of the great artists in the history of art. I wouldn't mind if he did influence me, but I don't think he wasted his time on me. Quintessential Saul. Dimensionality? When I am photographing something, I am not thinking of single dimension, triple dimension, four dimension. I don't think that way. I think there's something, and I take a picture. Saul Leiter. As for that art ecosystem I mentioned earlier, well, here's what he said about that in the Aletti interview, although I'll break it into two parts. First, you know, galleries usually decide what you are. This is you. This is the real you. This stuff here. This is not you. You like doing it, that's okay, but it isn't the real you. I'm telling you what the real you is. This is the real you right here. Saul Leiter. Like I said, subversive, or at least snarky. Though, to be fair, this was certainly not all that he said or felt about it, so let's get to part two. I am in the pleasant position of not having to worry, and I think it's a terribly nice thing not to worry. So in that sense, I am very grateful to Howard, and I am very grateful to Margaret for helping me achieve that pleasant condition of not caring about bills. Saul Leiter. It was through the Howard Greenberg Gallery that he gained financial equilibrium, and really, that means Howard himself, and it was through Howard's gallery that he met and came to deeply appreciate Margaret Erb, the woman who became his assistant, his friend, and now heads the Saul Leiter Foundation, the steward of his legacy. Nonetheless, Saul's snark is highly informative and germane to the twin questions of what makes a great photograph and what makes a photographer worthy. One might be tempted to assert something as simple as this. Great photographs and great photographers offer something new, even if it's old, have compelling stories, not much more than log lines perhaps, about the art and the artist rather than individual images, and both the photographer's story and the photographer's oeuvre are accessible, that is, understandable, to the people who have the wherewithal and inclination to buy them. Reductio ad absurdum? Maybe. Maybe not. But in either case, is it fair to assume that Saul knew himself better than anyone else, while the art ecosystem knew far better than he his value? I think so. Although, it's right, isn't it, that sometimes it takes someone else to help us see a fuller, clearer picture of ourselves. But how much of anyone can we know from a single interview lasting an hour or so? How can the totality of a human being, a lifetime of experiences, be communicated, never mind absorbed? Can the full complexity and richness of a life be captured like that? What do you think? Even though I think I'm lazy, I did a lot of stuff. Saul Leiter. The second set of things to strike me in this conversation with Aletti, and in his musings in the Thomas Leach documentary In No Great Hurry, is a philosophy, a relationship to money, pragmatism, a certain kind of laziness, intellectual laziness, to which I very much relate, and a delight, I think, in marching to the beat of his own drummer, all of which contributed to a set of limitations Saul chose to embrace. These limitations manifested themselves in Saul's choices about where and how he chose to live, of course, what he chose to do, of course, but most importantly for this video, in a number of far more prosaic reasons for choosing color slide film for his personal street photography, and how in turn slide film and the technology of the day imposed limitations on what he chose to capture and how he chose to capture it. Color photography was relatively new, complicated, expensive, difficult and slow, for example, but it was becoming truly accessible by the 1950s. And for someone who had difficulty paying his bills and called himself lazy, slide film in particular made perfect sense from economic and workflow perspectives. Saul said in the Leach documentary that he liked color slides because they came back as positives rather than negatives, and they came back pre-cut. In other words, slides were easier to view, easier to catalog, much faster to review, less imagination required, no intermediary step necessary, and no incremental cost to incur for disposables like chemical and paper. Very much like today's digital cameras. What about that whole thing about expired film? When I was young, I had very little money, and I sometimes borrowed, sometimes bought film that was expired, and I liked the results, but sometimes I used normal film. Saul Leiter. So much for that being a thing. But it gets even more interesting as he shifts gears to a more philosophical bent that makes it even clearer. I'm not a person who is rigid, who is committed to one way of doing things. Sometimes I try something, sometimes I try something else. I'm not a mannerist. There are people who develop a manner and they impose it on their work. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it gets to be boring. Saul Leiter. Yeah, but consistency, while the bane of artists, is practically a prerequisite for selling art. Isn't that what everyone says? As for a bias against color photography by the art establishment, fair enough. Color photography was seen by many as of little use beyond advertising. After all, there was painting for color, and it was easy enough to make the case that painting took far more work and skill. But photography's primacy over painting was its immediacy and superior representation of reality when immediacy counted, like the news. War, crime, famine, poverty, racism, anti-Semitism, big things, dramatic things, things that could teach us something about ourselves if we'd only look as an apex predator species. But what I hear far less often as a reason for preferring black and white to color photography in the first half of the 20th century is what I just mentioned a moment ago. Color photography was difficult, slow, complicated, expensive, offering subpar image quality, and associated with crass, hoi polloi consumerism. In short, not nearly as compelling visually or financially as black and white, not nearly as pedigreed. Especially for newspapers and magazines. Life magazine, for example, didn't run its first significant color photo essay until 1953, a 24-page spread photographed by Ernst Haas. As late as 1979, only 12% of newspapers in the U.S. were printing color photos at all. Never mind the processing, how difficult was it to shoot with color film? Well, when Kodachrome first became available as a photographic emulsion in 1935, it had been a cinefilm stock prior to that. It had a daylight balance ASA of just 8. 8. And from 1938 to 1951, that was it. Sheet film only, which also meant big, heavy, conspicuous, and slow cameras. When Kodachrome finally became available for 35mm film in 1951, the daylight balanced emulsion speed had been increased by a half stop to an ASA of 12. When was the last time you shot at ISO 12? This was an era in which no such thing as lens image stabilization, never mind in-body image stabilization, existed. It was an era when autofocus didn't exist, when the adage of F8, set it and forget it, increased the likelihood of getting an image in focus, but especially when combined with the use of a longer 90 or 150 millimeter lens in order to get some of the beautifully compressed shots Saul got, meant even slower shutter speeds. In other words, Saul operated in an era when motion blur or focus blur were often simply going to be part of the bargain for the excitement of working with color in a small, light, fast, and unobtrusive camera. The paradox, however, is that these limitations also provided power and grace, a sense of place, time, feeling, and mystery infused in so many of his images, at least to a modern eye. I sometimes am amazed by how much you can do as a photographer, how much quicker and easier it is as a medium. Saul Leiter. I want to return again to this notion of Saul's laziness, because in a way he was lazy, and he most certainly was not. This notion that photography makes things so much easier than painting was a fact, and not original. Cartier-Bresson expressed the very same view from the very same vantage point, that of a painter-turned-photographer who never turned his back on painting. I'm sure many others did as well. But Saul's recognition in particular of this fact might help explain why, when we visit with him in no great hurry, it appears that in addition to a wide array of film cameras, including to my great surprise and joy a Canon F1, the camera I bought, and hey, I still have it today, he's seen using several different digital cameras, including what I think might be that red 12-megapixel Lumix G1, maybe with a zoom lens, which offered a far faster workflow than film with zero marginal cost to see the images up close, and autofocus. I suspect Saul loved that. But what do I know? All of which is a very long way of saying, if I'm right about any of this, then I like his work even more because I can relate to the man even more. But what does any of this mean for you? I'll wrap it up this way. First, Saul Leiter's story is a microcosm not only of the art ecosystem that helps us answer the questions, what makes a great photograph and what makes a photographer worthy, but a prompt to question our assumptions about what we know and what's important. That is, what we can know about another human being, what we will never know about another human being, even what we do or do not know about ourselves. His take on things is refreshingly unadorned, funny, smart, I think, maybe even wise. A little sad, perhaps, in what he chooses not to share, but coupled with his story, to the extent we know it, reaffirms the notion that in the end, beyond craftsmanship, which, when mastered, can, with legitimacy, be tossed out the window, what makes a great photograph is defined by the person viewing the photograph, because great is a subjective value judgment. If the image is just for you, it's who you are inside that determines whether or not the image is great. This might be one of the true joys of photography. It is both about technical mastery and artistic voice. Each of us gets to decide what the right amount of either one is for ourselves, and we can spend an entire lifetime honing one, the other, or both. It's also a darn good way just to get out of the house and engage with the world. However, if we're talking about a photograph by you that you wish to share, that is, you are asking something of someone, an investment of their time to look at it, then a great photograph is defined by who that person is inside. The degree to which your image resonates with that person, shows that person something different, teaches that person something new, speaks to that person, evokes a strong feeling in that person, a response which that person values and wants to experience again. Which in turn means, in the end, that it is not about trying to make a photograph for some amorphous notion of what people think is great, but instead, working on you, working on yourself. Craftsmanship, yes, of course, but I'm talking about who you are as a person, your values, your relationships, your interests, your discipline, your stamina, your humor, your joy, your ability to forgive yourself and others, your ability to make what you feel is important accessible to other people, your tribe. As for what makes a photographer worthy, on the one hand, same line of reasoning is what makes great photography, reducible at the risk of oversimplification to different strokes for different folks. But on the other hand, if you're asking me what I think makes a photographer worthy, well, I've kind of just told you. I think it begins with the person. how that person's values, sensibilities, and behavior come through in that person's body of work with consistency and resonate with the viewers of that work. And most importantly, again, from my perspective, and I'm just one person, that the subjects and themes that person chooses to share in that work somehow, in some infinitesimally small way, make the world a better place. Subjects and themes which are non-trivial. But hey, that's just me. Your mileage may vary, and as always, that's just fine. That's the whole point. A big shout out to KEH for sponsoring this video, a great resource for finding just this kind of gear. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, join the conversation in the comments section below because this is an exceptional audience. If you'd like help with a portfolio review, gear selection, finding or honing your artistic voice, sign up for a one-on-one mentoring video call via Zoom at 3bmep.com/booking. Finally, please consider supporting our work by using the no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, sending us coffee money via PayPal, or most especially, joining us on Patreon, links down below as well. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.